All right, we're going to go ahead and get started back up on part 2 of the ABCs of starting a WISP. Part 1 was so exciting that we now have to have the sequel, which will be different than the first one. I've got 3 panelists that are going to talk today. We're going to talk about taking your business to the next level after you've gotten started. We're going to talk about the mapping, and we're going to talk about regulatory and legal issues. So I'm going to go ahead and hand over the presentation and the microphone over to Chuck Hogg.
So thank you, Alex. A little bit about me. My name's Chuck Hogg. I have a company called Shelby Broadband. We're based out of Kentucky. I've been a WISPA board member since 2011, current president and chairman of the board, and we've been an ISP since 2006. I think we're the largest WISP in Kentucky still, serving southern Indiana to east of Lexington, and we've got over 100 sites serving 2,900 plus wireless customers. In addition to that, 4 years ago we started deploying a lot of fiber, and we're somewhere in the range of 52 miles of fiber. We add about 2 to 3 miles of fiber a month. So what I've been asked to talk about is a little bit about the venture of our business from when we kind of started and how the steps we took to kind of take it to the next level. To give you a little bit of that background about our business, we started out of community need, probably the same way that a lot of you will have started or have started. And there was an article in the paper that basically said that between these 2 cities that had DSL and cable, that nobody could get high-speed internet service. And we were able to make that work by doing wireless, and it was not what we were doing primarily. We weren't even an ISP at the time. But my business partner had the knowledge from his previous work, and we were able to get this connection going between us and a silo. And we were able to get the service working between us and a silo from a farmer. And we went to that farmer and basically said, hey, we want to provide service. If you'll let us do this, we'll get you free internet service. And he had dial-up, so of course that was an awesome option for him. And we started off with, I think it was multiple DSL lines, and then quickly we grew the business to like 30 or 50 customers, and we realized that the phone was ringing off the hook, and we had something that was in high demand and people really wanted. There was no supply from anybody else that was being provided, and so we had a business. Our next steps were to get fiber. We ended up getting, I think at the time it seems small now, but it was a 10 meg fiber connection to the internet, and that was upgradable to 100 megs so that we could quickly make the upgrade as we grew. And somewhere by the end of the year, I think we reached a little over 150, 200 customers in about a 6-month period. And over those years, I was the money guy. I was the guy that was always trying to figure out how to squeeze an extra dollar out of somebody. And we always wanted to try and keep our costs low at the same time. So we had to try and figure out different ways that would set us apart from other people. And I knew at some point that the big guys would come chasing, and they were going to come after us and go after our customer base and try and offer services to compete with us. So if we fast forward a little bit, we continue to grow that side of the business quite significantly. And one of the issues that we started to face was connectivity to different other companies and other networks. We felt like it was somewhat throttled in between. Here we had a DIA internet connection, but when somebody's trying to stream video, it just wasn't working properly. And we couldn't figure out why for a while, and then we started to realize that the network that we were running off of was at the max capacity with their peer with YouTube and Netflix and these other guys. So as a part of the experience for our customers, they were limited by what our upstream was able to provide us. So that became a problem. And, so we tried to figure out ways, how do we advance our services so that we're not interfered by somebody else? And, what were some of the other services that we could sell to these customers that were a value add to what we were already doing? After that, we kind of took the business to the next level of We had acquired some businesses around us. We continued to grow. We stretched our network out to about 80 miles. And it was 80 miles east and west, and I think 65 miles north and south. So if you kind of draw all that diamond shape, that's about the size of our network. And we figured out that one of the issues that we faced in Kentucky was that we had all these tall oak trees and rolling hills, and 900 megahertz could only go so far, and we needed really to have a solution that we would be able to push all the way to the home that would be cost effective for us, cost effective for the customer, and that's why we kind of started looking at doing some hybrid networks. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then in the end, we'll kind of go over the value proposition, and I think I heard a little bit about that at the end of the previous session. So let's first talk about this peering piece. Like I said, our customers were somewhat throttled to what our upstream bandwidth was able to accommodate. And, I don't say that our upstream connection was at capacity, but our upstream connection, when we were connected to them and our customers were going to somebody else's network, whether it was Facebook or Google or YouTube, that connection between our provider and them was at capacity. So when somebody would be scrolling on Facebook, videos wouldn't load. It wouldn't be instantaneous like it is for other areas of the world. So what we focused on, actually what the first step of this was, I think it was 4 years ago, I tried to get a cooperative group of WISP together to enter into these peering facilities, which these are major peering connections across the United States, and these facilities where big major networks come together and connect. So you'll be able to get into these facilities and directly connect to the likes of Google, Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, and all these other guys. And what that does is that eliminates that middleman that's throttling or causing problems for your customers. So we tried to get with a cooperative group of people because this had a significant expense in each one of these facilities. And the reality of the situation is that we're putting in basically a router, a switch, and that's about it. We don't need servers and a full rack and all this other stuff. From there, we were able to get a couple of us to work together. I work with a guy named Faisal in Atlanta, and we directly connect through the Telex facility in Atlanta, Georgia. In the Telex facility, we basically connect directly to Facebook. Facebook's major data centers right there, I think, in North Carolina. So we directly connect to their network, and I think out of that one facility alone, it's somewhere over 1,700 other networks that we directly connect to. So when a customer comes on to our service or our network, there's no middleman. There's a hop to our facility in Simpsonville, Kentucky, and then there's a hop to Atlanta, Georgia, and then there's a hop to Facebook's network. So we don't have all these intermediaries that could potentially cause problems for customers on our network. So what a lot of you probably have done is you've gone to AT&T and said, I need a DIA connection, 1 gig, 10 gig, whatever it might be. What you might consider is getting a transport circuit. It's going to be cheaper because they don't have to provide the internet over it. But you can get a transport circuit, like for example, when I first started doing this, the 10 megabit fiber connection from AT&T, I was paying $1,700 a month. And the 10 gig connection that I have today to go to Atlanta, I think is around $4,000 a month. So you can see the cost difference there is significant. Shortly after that, we partnered up with a group in Chicago, and we were able to get into the Equinix facility in Chicago. We lit up another 10 gig circuit to get up there. And today we have 20 gig of capacity coming back to our facility, and we're paying somewhere in the range of like about $9,000 a month. The big benefits of this is eliminating that middleman. I mean, I can't express this enough, is that you're reducing your overall latency. For example, I think we're like 13 milliseconds off of Facebook now, whereas before we were in the 40 to 50 millisecond range. YouTube is like 9 milliseconds. Google's like 9 milliseconds. All these networks that we used to have to go through an intermediary were creating latency and other issues for us. And another example is that as soon as we turned up some of these connections, Google certified us 4K across our entire network. So now, instead of just being on the video report as a provider that kind of does 4K, we're now a 4K provider. 100% of the time. This improves the quality of experience because not only are you directly connecting to these big major networks, but you're also directly connecting to these other smaller networks too, other smaller ISPs that may have other customers or business customers where they may be interconnecting with VPNs and things like that. So that really helped out. It helped out in two ways. One, it reduced our cost, and two, it made the quality of experience for the customer significantly better. And this is kind of like the next step. So when you go from, you have your 100 meg connection to your gig connection, as soon as you get to that gig connection, that's when you need to start looking at transport. At 500 meg, it's kind of iffy. They're going to deploy it over a gig circuit anyway, but as soon as you get to that point where you have about a gigabit of bandwidth, you need to start looking at getting transport to one of these major facilities. I'm pretty sure that there's several other vendor members now that currently sell peering connectivity. So I recommend you kind of maybe touch base with them in the exhibit hall. But there's already other players that are in this space too, that are already working together. And I'm not trying to make a sales pitch here, but you can work with people like me or Faisal or anybody else that has these connectivity options in these major peering facilities already at a low cost, so that you don't have to deploy a $10,000 router or a 10 gig switch and all these other things and have remote hands and all that kind of stuff. So let's talk a little bit about additional revenue opportunities. I know when we first started, the only easy revenue opportunity that we thought about was, hey, let's sell a router, right? I mean, it's just an easy thing for us to do, but you need to be able to take it to that next step. And our fiber services, we spend a lot of time on customer service and quality of experience. When the internet does not work in the basement, it is your problem. When the internet does not work in the corner of the house, it is your problem, because that's the way they perceive it. Gone is, the thought process of handing off an Ethernet connection to somebody and letting them manage their own network. It doesn't work out. It's not the best quality of experience. They don't have the technical skill sets to always be able to manage their own Wi-Fi. You can also offer some certain things like content filtering. If you're doing managed routers, like for a long time we were selling MikroTik as our managed router. That allowed us to mitigate the RF interference. We knew what the equipment was at their house, and if we're running on that same band, we're able to avoid the frequency that we're using on our equipment and place their wireless router on equipment that would not interfere. In addition to that, there's also other opportunities for VPNs and layer 2 services between facilities for other businesses and other customers. I'll give another example. We have a big insurance company in Louisville, Kentucky called Humana. I'm sure some of you may have heard of them. We have probably 70 of their remote workers on our network. They are a customer of ours that works really well with us, and we have a specific setup for them that helps facilitate the work that they're able to do. Voice over IP. This one used to be a lot more difficult than it is today. There's a lot of providers out there today that are willing to wholesale to you at pretty much cost. It's a numbers game. It's a volume game. If you're not going to be able to turn up 1,000 lines of voice, I'd kind of recommend that you look at what the wholesale offerings are available to you. Back when we started doing this, there wasn't a whole lot of wholesale opportunities that were affordable, that made sense in cost effectiveness. So we spun up our own NetSapiens soft switch platform. And it was a significant investment for us, but we were able to be able to offer business services and a voice platform, which we weren't offered before. And it was a step up from things like Asterisk and FreeSwitch and those other opportunities. On the commercial side, we saw a huge growth. We also operate an operation down in New Orleans, Louisiana. I want to say that within the first 8 months of us working down there, I think we reached to about 400 lines. The commercial space down there was huge. It also introduced an opportunity for us to get roof rights and whatnot on a multitude of the buildings in New Orleans. And that business today has grown to well over 1,000 lines. And it's a very, very profitable business once you hit that magic number. Wholesale satellite opportunities. And I was actually talking about this one today. We don't advertise it, but we had a situation about 2 years ago where Crown Castle decided that they really didn't want us as a tenant anymore. Our rent went from $800 to almost $3,000 per tower per month. And that just was not a cost-effective option for us. We could not provide services and make money at the same time off of those kind of numbers. So what we ended up having to do was discontinue all those sites, and we had to go back to all these people, and they still wanted something. They begged for something, whether it was cellular or satellite. They didn't care. They had to have something. And so about 40% of those customers, we were able to have a wholesale deal with Exceed, Viasat, and we bill the customer directly, and they bill us directly. So it's a very nice program because this allowed us an opportunity to retain these customers instantly without having to go and rebuild this whole network in this area. It actually allowed us to become more profitable on these customers as well, because now the customer that was paying $30, $40, $50 a month for their internet service, they were paying $40 to $50 on average, but then at the end of the month or 20 days into their month, they ran out of bandwidth and they needed more. So that overage fee came back to us, and we were able to increase the revenue that we were receiving as a result of them using more. And believe it or not, a 900 megahertz customer that was only getting half a meg to a meg at the time, now they were getting 8 to 10 megabit on satellite, and boy, were they happy to use it. So the end of that situation actually turned into a net revenue positive versus what they were previously on wireless. Today, we offer that as an option when people call in and they can't get our service. They can't get our service, or if we go out there and they have that big, tall oak tree in front of the house that radio mobile or tower coverage didn't account for, then we can also offer satellite as an option. And then IP video TV. So for us, we've kind of dabbled in this. It's difficult. A lot of regulation on locals. And if you can't make a differentiation, in my opinion, if you can't make a differentiation between yourself and the likes of Sling and DirecTV Now and PlayStation View and YouTube TV, you're not able to really take advantage of the offerings. These guys have big corporate money behind them, and people are just going to use your internet data pipe to stream that service. So if you're able to make a deal with your local channels and be able to offer those services, that would definitely be an extra revenue opportunity. So let me talk a little bit about the hybrid fiber wireless and how we got into that, how we built that out, and why we got into doing this. From our facility, we have probably 7 sites that directly connect through high-capacity licensed backhaul. And then we have another 4 sites that are fiber-fed directly from our facility. So I have these sites, these tower sites, where we're able to repeat from and offer bandwidth to, but typically they're nowhere near capacity, typically. So essentially what I have is a tower that may have a gigabit of speed to it, but we're only providing at peak maybe 40, 50, 70, 80 megabit to the customers in that area. It would be difficult for us to build that middle mile outside of our city and into these areas, permitting, crossing highways, crossing railroad tracks, you name it. So what we decided to do was we would build off our existing wireless infrastructure where we had either a fiber backbone already in place or some type of high-capacity licensed microwave. This is network facilities that are already built, we're already paying for on a monthly basis. Now, how do we use those facilities to make more or do more? So what we ended up doing was basically placing fiber cabinets at the base of our towers. And we started building fiber from our towers into some of these subdivisions that were nearby. And if they were too far away, and too far away could be a mile. If they were a mile away, we'd put up an air fiber first from the tower and then shoot it over to that cabinet. So we eliminated that cost, the high cost of the middle mile where we're passing, maybe 10, 5 maybe homes a mile. It just depends on the density, where it's super expensive, and replace that with a high-capacity backhaul. We've done that project, we've repeated that project about 7 times, and that continues to be a very easy way for us to transition customers that used to be on wireless onto fiber so that we can offer them higher bandwidth, or in areas where we can go in and compete with DSL and cable that we didn't really focus on competing with before. And with today's technology and the cost of equipment, it used to be that the cost of the fiber equipment was just so expensive that there would be no way that you would ever consider it. The ROIs would just be pushed out forever. But I'll give an example today. We just finished up a project. It was a 100-home subdivision. The cost of our electronics, the cabinet, the air fiber, ended up being about $10,000. All right, and then when you start thinking about what you put into a tower itself, you're not far off from those same costs. But what the big difference is that we have a huge part of construction labor. And that's what you avoid by doing wireless, is that you avoid that construction labor. We dug our heels deep, and we ended up getting into these projects. But I'm able to now do these projects, and we're able to see our ROI come down in at around 13 months. And some of them been as low as 10. And that's primarily because when we go into these small subdivisions in these areas where we're competing against DSL or cable, primarily we're getting close to 95 to 100% take rate. People are just that unhappy. So we didn't give it away either. You know, we didn't do free installations. We didn't go up and offer some type of gimmick or an iPad or an Xbox or whatever the ILEC was offering. We went in there and we told them, hey, you know, it's gonna be $1 a foot from the road. That's however far your house is, that's what the cost is. And what we ended up subsidizing on our side was the backbone part of the network and the electronics infrastructure. So they've paid for really the connectivity to their home, and we weren't really upended if somebody didn't take it. We were only upended if a huge portion of a subdivision wouldn't take the service. So our ROI targets came closer and closer to wireless, but I will say speed of deployment is significantly less. I mean, you can slap up an AP on a tower in a day and go sign up customers the same day. You're not going to be able to do that with fiber. The 100 customer subdivision that we completed took about 3 months. That's a long time to sign up 100 customers. But it can be done. So let's talk a little bit about your value proposition. I think I heard a little bit about this going on in the last part of the session, but you know, what separates you apart from your competition? Or why would they choose you over satellite? A lot of the reasons that we hear back from our customers is because of local service. They like being able to call us and get our technicians. You know, our technicians, sometimes the people they're talking to are the same people that did their installation. So that local service element is very, very key. We've won, I can't tell you how many different commercial contracts on local service alone. And when you have good local service, your commercial customers will talk well about you, and they will definitely be your advocate. High quality of experience. Again, I kind of touched with that on the peering. The internet usage is trending away from just being email and web surfing, and has been moved to, so I think 60% of our usage is video streaming today. I mean, it's huge. People leave that Netflix running, people leave that YouTube running, whatever that service is that's streaming, they leave it running, they leave their house, go grocery shopping, whatever, and that service is still going, right? So making sure that you're able to maintain a high quality of experience for your customers is key. Another way you can do that is through using other services like maybe a Procera or Sandvine or some of these others, where you can prioritize the type of bandwidth that is being used by your consumer or your customers. Whether it's video or you're prioritizing VPN, whatever it might be, that's one way that you can affect the quality of experience. Being easily reachable. You know, a lot of my commercial customers have my cell phone. They have my cell phone, the president of the company, not, you know, some tech that's going to come out and fix their service. They have somebody that's the direct line of communication that can try to resolve their issues quickly. Being approachable, making yourself available. You know, if you're just in there and you sell it and then you don't go back and follow up with the customer and make them your friend, you know, think about what that's going to do to your business in the next year when the contract comes up for renewal. And then your commitment to the community. I think this is also important because when you're the local company and you're out there fighting against the big guys, they're advertising on top of you all day long. They're sending gift cards. They're sending all kinds of things that they can do to try and get those customers to transition back to them. And in our last subdivision that we took over, there was when we did our survey, around about 60 people were with the big ILEC in our area. And about a month later, after they transitioned over to us, they were getting $400 gift cards to come back. So that just shows to show you, what kind of power they have in their marketing. So I'll leave that up for now. I'm getting told I'm at time. But the additional sessions covering these topics, we've put them up here for you to see, and highly recommend that you check some of them out. Some of them are mine, and some of them are other people's. So look forward to seeing you at the rest of the show. Thank you. Oh, I guess we're doing questions. You want questions now or after?
If you have any questions, you're going to ask him now. Yeah, we're doing questions. Do you have any questions for Chuck? Just repeat the question.
So I think the way I understand the question, am I seeing more and more 4K usage? Okay, yes, absolutely. If it's available, they're streaming it. Absolutely. Okay, so you want me to explain it a little bit better again? All right, so when you purchase connectivity with a big ILEC, you typically buy a DI, a dedicated internet access connection. And the other opportunity that you have is to buy a transport connection. That transport can be from your facility to a major peering facility someplace else in the U.S. I'm smack dab in the middle between Chicago and Atlanta, and both of them are big major peering facilities, so they work out well for us. Other parts of the U.S., Houston, Dallas, Denver, Washington, Seattle, they have 6. I mean, California, they're all spread out all across the U.S., and finding one that's the closest to you would be the most beneficial. That help? Okay. So the question is, why did we start doing fiber as the last mile instead of wireless? We have really tall oak trees and lots of rolling hills, and 5 gigahertz is almost a non-usable spectrum for point to multipoint for us. We're primarily 2.4, 365, and 900 megahertz, and I wanted to be able to offer bigger bandwidth to these customers. And the challenge was I could go in and put in microcells or small cells, if you will. When we started looking at the cost effectiveness of doing that versus building fiber, over a 4-year period, it was a whole lot better for us to do fiber. Fiber to the actual home. So what we have the customer pay for is the last from the road to their home. So not in the in-between. We cover that part as part of our financial model.
You get access to the trunk, or you add your own fiber?
Get access to the what?
You add your own fiber in the street?
Yes. So we're shortly after we became an ISP, we became a CLEC as well. So we have full access to the right-of-way. And typically any easements that have unnamed utilities. So most areas, like in our county, for example, the way that the Kentucky Constitution is written is that we have access to the right-of-way, and we don't have to go through any permitting process or anything like that.
But isn't it also true that in your hybrid model, where you have a wireless connection into a subdivision, then you don't really need to be a CLEC to service that subdivision?
Right, you don't have to be a CLEC. That was the easiest way for us to do it in Kentucky. Kentucky is a little bit strange in the way that they opted out of some of the rules from the Telecommunications Act, and they manage, like for example, they manage all their own pole attachments. They don't go through the FCC and follow federal rules on that. So there's a little bit different process depending on the state and where you live in. Title II kind of helped out a lot with that. I'm sure John will help on the regulatory side with that, but the accessibility to right-of-way is a lot easier today than it was before. And our per mile costs come in right about $20,000 to $25,000 a mile. And when we're looking at doing that, I think we were somewhere in the 5-mile range for 100 homes. So it took us to about $100,000 for 100 homes, and that came out to be about $1,000 a home. We ended up having the customer cover about $600 of that. It'd be a little bit cheaper. We currently don't do that. We have pole attachment agreements, but they're actually kind of expensive. $30 per pole per year. And when I've got to service a customer maybe 1,000 feet off the road, that might be an extra 15 poles. And building that cost model back into the financial model is a little difficult, so we chose to go underground. Yep.
Ugh.
Franchise agreements suck. That's just the best way to put it. Yeah, so it depends. In Louisville, the franchise agreements are actually very good because they want Google there. So they've done a lot of work to make sure that it's a competitive marketplace for fiber providers. In my little podunk town of 650 homes, it's actually 6 times more expensive than for me to operate in the city of Louisville. Same goes for the neighboring city, and getting through these processes of trying to make sure that they understand what the franchise does for them, and make sure that they understand that, for example, one of the things that really chapped me is that they wanted a $100,000 line of credit to be maintained through the duration of the franchise to cover the cost of the franchise fees, the potential liability. The potential liability of the franchise fees was only $5,000 a year. So why have a $100,000 line of credit open to cover those franchise fees? Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the big guys that are coming in behind me, AT&T or Spectrum or whoever it is, Windstream, I mean, $100,000 line of credit, they have that all day long.
2 more questions, sir.
How do you determine your bandwidth speeds for sale?
So
The speed is also the offering.
So what we did first was what were the capabilities of the equipment. So I'm sure a lot of you that use multiple frequencies realize that the 900 megahertz spectrum has a limited capacity in comparison to like maybe 5 gigahertz or even 2.4 gigahertz. And so what we did was we came up with plans that were, at the time, usable for people to access the internet, but also was a cost-effective model for us to deploy, so that when we're making a deployment on an access point, we're still getting 15 to 20 customers. And so for us, what we looked about was, what's the market? What's the alternative provide? And typically, the cell carriers and all these other guys, they have like a very introductory level plan with low bandwidth caps that's in the $30 to $40 range. And so what we did was we were in that $40 range, but we had a really low speed. And then as time grew on and equipment became faster and equipment became more advanced, we kind of turned the knob a little bit. I think over the course of 4 years, we doubled our speeds on all of our packages. So we looked at it from a capacity standpoint on a per tower basis. That's how we originally did it. Fast forward to today, and we spent, about 3 months ago, we spent a lot of time on what do the customers actually need versus what they actually want. And if they really want that high bandwidth package plan, then we need to make sure that they pay for it. So customers want the 20, the 25, or 50 megabit. But when your capacity level on an access point might be only 80 to 90 megabit, how can you get away with selling 10, 15, 20 of those plans, right? There's some small amount of oversell. But let me tell you, that video streaming crops up every year. Every year it keeps more and more and more. So when you're overselling your plans, you got to think about that capacity level, because it's diminishing as more and more usage happens, right? So what we did was we said, from our fiber network, we realized that most people use an average between 3 and 7 megabit. That's just what the average, no matter if they were a 200 megabit customer or a 100 megabit customer, didn't matter. That's just basically what they used. And of course, we had some anomalies from the big super heavy tech guys that did a lot of usage, but really the core of the people only used that 3 to 7 megabit. So we went back and we redesigned our wireless plans to our base plan would be a 5 megabit package. And I think we went to a 15 megabit package as the next step. But as soon as you breached that threshold of 15 megabit and went to 20 megabit, we made it super expensive. I think our plan is $110 a month for a 20 megabit package. But we did that on purpose because we didn't want to run into capacity issues in the future. So we set our pricing in a way that once we reached a capacity constraint on a tower, we could go up and split the sector and maybe put up 2 sectors. Or take an Omni and put up 4 sectors. So you got to look at what your overall capacity is, what your consumers are going to be using, and what the equipment's capable of, and then realize what the business model might be on your tower leasing and things like that.
One more question right here. Yeah, young lady with the Wonder Woman outfit.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yes, ma'am. With Faisal? Yeah, that's his name. His name is Faisal MTS. He's been a long time WISPA member. His company is Snappy DSL, I believe. He's based out of Florida. He also operates in the Miami Internet Exchange as well.
All right, so we're going to move on to the regulatory side and have John Allen tell us a little bit about some of the stuff you guys need to pay attention to, and then we'll go to the mapping.
Hi, everyone. A lot of new faces in the audience, at least to me, so I'll take a moment to introduce myself. My name is John Allen. I'm a communications lawyer. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I work a few miles from the Federal Communications Commission. Native North Carolinian. I've lived half of my life in Virginia, and a lot of the work that I do focuses on transactional and regulatory aspects of the spectrum industries. So I decided to take our topic here to heart, the ABCs of being a WISP, and while I don't have slides, I do have access to the alphabet. And I think that what I'd like to do is proceed through the alphabet to give you sort of a cloud view of some of the key legal and regulatory considerations for the industry. And I just want to thank WISPA and Alex for the opportunity to have this presentation. I also want to thank Alex because now instead of me being the speaker between you and the beer, it's going to be Jim.
Yeah.
So A is for advocacy, and while WISPA is an advocacy organization, I'm here to emphasize the point that a lot of advocacy is local and it takes many forms. And there will be many venues and opportunities where an individual company can make their voice heard before the FCC on a variety of matters in particular. And just pointing out as the debate continues on things like CBRS and mid-band spectrum, advocacy is an opportunity for even a smaller company to participate and help to shape the process. B and C for me are for bargaining and contracts. And I mention these in particular because I think folks may not realize when they enter this industry how over time they will accumulate a variety of legal relationships that are defined by contracts and the amount of time that they're going to have to spend negotiating to get access to the things that they need to help provide service. So one of my pointers for a company just starting out is to become aware of the importance of having good contract management, particularly as your company grows, knowing your deadlines and your triggers and that sort of thing, and centralizing the information, I think is helpful on an ongoing basis, just from a management perspective, but also from call it a risk management perspective, from the avoidance of loss by problems that are falling through the contracts. D is for definitions, and in this industry in particular, definitions are critical. Why? Because definitions have legal consequences. I'd like to emphasize, for example, if the service you provide is internet versus the service that you provide being voice versus the service that you provide being video, there are different regulatory consequences based on what that classification is. It's the law that determines what the classification is and how it necessarily would impact your company. But I'm just drawing the point out that in going into this industry, it may not be intuitive that different types of services may be regulated differently. I'll actually harp on that a little bit more as we go. E is for entity. And there was discussion earlier about the importance of the choice of entity from a tax standpoint, and how your mileage may vary in terms of your company and your governance and how you want to allocate those rights and responsibilities. But I just want to emphasize that from the outset, there's kind of a set it and forget it aspect to a choice of entity. It may be that you set up a corporate form that works really well when you're just starting out, but then it kind of becomes too tight to really fit as your company grows. So just sort of pointing out here that even starting out, it's good to look to the future. Nathan mentioned the buy-sell agreement, for example. Looking to the future and planning ahead for contingencies if there are changes in either your governing form or the parties who have ownership stakes in your company. F is for forms, and if you don't like paperwork, this is not the industry for you. There are a variety of forms that, in fact, there's a separate panel on this, right, in terms of doing form filings or something like that. It's important to get to know, Form 477, Form 499, and, other federal forms in particular, but also, there's state and local requirements that may apply. So that's something to be prepared for if you're new for the industry. A whole lot of time is spent on the regulatory compliance side because, let's face it, this is the sale of the internet. This isn't widgets. G is for government, and you always hear I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I'm pointing out government because I think it's important for folks to realize sort of the different entities that may have a stake in how your business is run and how you can compete effectively against others. So we're talking the federal and state level, and in particular, there's a heavy layer of federal regulation in this industry. But sometimes it's localities who have a big voice in shaping what your deployments look like. So I think you have to buy into this industry with the idea and the understanding that you're going to have to do a lot of reading, research, review, becoming aware of the ways that the government has some say in how you're shaping your business. H is for hybrid, and sort of to spring off of Chuck's point earlier, and to tie into this whole D is for definitions point. If you're deploying a hybrid network that has some components of fiber and some components of wireless, it's important to remember that these are services that at different levels are regulated differently. And so it's sort of, while it's important, from an ARPU standpoint for a company to have, the wherewithal to be flexible in terms of, whether or not they can, meet a need through fiber or wireless, it's also important to understand that, there are different rights and responsibilities to each type of distribution. So you'll hear a lot about, hybrid networks, and I'm just making the point here, it's important to kind of recognize that distinction, and that spectrum is regulated very differently from wires that get buried in the ground. I is for intellectual property, and I mention this because this is something that I see fairly often. When you have a startup company, there are a lot of irons in the fire, when you're trying to get a business off the ground, and it's an important time to kind of take stock in how much of the material you're creating might be something that needs to be protected from third parties. Either you have some marketing materials that ought to be subject to copyright, or even more commonly, you may have a brand that you're trying to protect through the law of trademark, or sometimes you may have a process that is a matter of trade secrets. More and more, there's kind of that set it and forget it issue as well. I have recommended to clients they consider the value in these types of materials that they're creating and coming up with ways of protecting the ones that they think will be valuable over time. So I is for intellectual property. J is for jurisdiction. And the point about jurisdiction is simply this. If you've got a problem, it's important to know who has the authority to help you solve it. And when you talk about the mandates of overlapping government entities and the fact that we're talking about a service that's provided in a customer-facing type of service, it's important to know who has jurisdiction to address your issue and who doesn't, because that way you avoid wasting a lot of time that you might have spent talking to the wrong people. Jurisdiction also has another component, which harken back to something like federalism, which is it's important to understand when your locality is trying to legislate or regulate in an area where they're actually preempted by the feds in some way. And you'll find this from time to time in a lot of areas when you're dealing with localities. So J is for jurisdiction. For me, K is always about knowledge. And I'm talking about two types of knowledge. Number one, you can really get a lot of good information when you come to a trade show like this, not just when you attend the sessions and when you're participating in a panel, but, on the walk over to the elevator or next to someone, at the blackjack table, you can really get a lot of important information. But I'm talking about knowledge too in a legal sense, because here's a soapbox that I'm pretty persistent with. You have to, approach this business from the standpoint of knowing the importance of knowledge and the legal ramifications of not having it. In other words, the fact that a company that's just starting out and is small and is not aware of how certain rules apply, that's rarely an opportunity to avoid some kind of sanction. So knowledge is important. So I hang that off of the letter K. For L, I have a tie between litigation and legislation. So these are aspects of the legal system that directly or indirectly will reflect your business, right? Because other companies may litigate legal issues that become law and affect how you have to run your business, while your elected officials engage in legislative efforts that also have that kind of effect. I know it's a legislative session right now, but you will find certainly that within the association here, legislation has become, engagement with legislators has become an increasingly important plank in the advocacy effort overall. M is for mobility, and understanding that fixed wireless and mobile wireless are not just different things as a matter of business, but they're different things regulatorily. And if you're deciding that you've gotten to the point where you want to become a mobile provider, it's important to recognize that different rules govern that kind of service at the FCC level. And a lot of the policy debates right now involving speeds of broadband and some other matters I'll touch on a little later in this presentation. A lot of those kind of spring from whether or not you're talking about a mobile carrier versus a fixed wireless provider. So M is for mobility. I'm combining N and O. N is net neutrality, O is open internet. And they're basically sides of the same coin. This is one of the fundamental policy debates in the District of Columbia that affects this industry. And that's why you hear a lot of folks talking about the importance of the ISP as whether or not it should be regulated as some sort of gatekeeper, and talking about what are the legal responsibilities in terms of making your customers access something that's offered in some sort of even kind of commie carrier basis, or whether or not it's something that's less like traditional telephone regulation. Open internet, I will mention because of the importance of offering a disclosure statement. There is an exemption for small providers for some of the required disclosures of the FCC, but not for some more fundamental disclosures. So make sure that if you're completely new to this industry, you kind of get your arms wrapped around the net neutrality and open internet debate, because it affects everybody who uses a pipe to access the web. P is for privacy, and I'll also put in parens here CP and I. And it's important to sort of recognize, privacy is an important issue on the web from your customer's perspective, but also in terms of your legal obligations and what information you have to protect. It's important also to see kind of the large trend at the FCC, which is under the current FCC, there's been an effort to roll back the rules that were adopted last year to increase these sorts of privacy regulations. And so now we're kind of back to where we were a year or so ago and prior. But the FCC is not the only agency with a say in this debate. And it's important to recognize that the Federal Trade Commission, for example, has regulatory authority over the privacy policies and promises that an ISP makes to its customers. But also you find a number of states have gotten into the act. And particularly if you're in California, you'll find that there are a whole bunch of rules that apply to you as an operator there. P is for privacy. Q is for questioning, because there weren't a lot of good options starting with the letter Q, but I think questioning is important for success in this industry, because there are so many facets to kind of get your arms around and so many factors involved in your success. I would suggest that coming to an event like WISPA and engaging with people is a fine time to get your questions answered, and maybe even get keyed into some questions you didn't even know that you should ask. All very important benefits of coming to an event like this. R is for regulation, and I won't spend a lot of time on that other than to say, this industry, by being so heavily regulated, there's a lot to keep tabs on, certainly. And so that's another reason why it's good to be engaged with the membership here and kind of find out about some of these things. S, of course, is for Spectrum, because that's the lifeblood of the business of a wireless ISP. I'm pointing to Spectrum only because when you saw the slide earlier about the different types of spectrum opportunities that might exist out there, it's important to know that different service rules apply to different bands of spectrum, different construction requirements, different engineering standards, such as what types of interference protection have to be enjoyed, or what kind of privileges there are accordingly. So the point being that while spectrum is the lifeblood and it's sort of the oxygen of the industry, it's not fungible. And different bands not only have different characteristics in terms of physics, they also have different characteristics in terms of their business benefits and the regulatory obligations that may attach to them. T is for Title I and Title II. Another fundamental part of the net neutrality debate is how the FCC is classifying this industry. And if it's a Title II classification, then the industry would be regulated more like traditional telcos, i.e. much more regulation due to that common carrier status. But until recently, Title I was the rule of the day that the FCC had propounded over many years, with the idea of the FCC not wanting to stand in the way of the internet really taking off as an industry. So when you hear the Title I versus Title II debate, those are important touchstones for this industry, and it's a time to keep your ears perked and listen closely. U is for Universal Service, and Connect America Fund is part of the Universal Service, and that is a key plank of the Federal Communications Commission and state authorities and their role in directing subsidies to spur the deployment of telecommunications service, and more recently broadband. You're going to hear a lot about USF and Connect America Fund over your time here, and that's one of the most important issues out there for the industry, because it's important to know, one, if there are opportunities for you to participate to get access to some of these subsidies, or number two, it's important to know whether or not some of these subsidies may be susceptible to being used to fund your competition. So regulatory authority in DC has a lot to say with respect to what the competition looks like on the ground in your area. V is for vendors, W is for WISPA. They're both very good resources to get a lot of questions answered. I learn a lot at these shows just from talking to people, and I think others who've been doing this a long time would agree. X is for X-ray, because I was narrowing it down to things like Xylophone and Xanadu and Xerxes, and you're really running out of options. So let's just go with X-ray and be done with it. Y is for years, and I say years because I would say that if you're interested in becoming part of this industry, you need to kind of embrace the time requirement that we're talking about here. This is not something that gets grown in a day, and it's a very accretive kind of process. So I think it's important to go in with open mind and eyes wide open in particular to recognize, okay, this is the kind of time frame that we're looking at, and to recognize the importance of timing in terms of your specific markets and the opportunities there. Lastly, I've made it to Z, and another letter that didn't have a ton of options. So I went with the word zeitgeist, because I think it's important not just in terms of trying to run a business, but to understand your business's place in the bigger picture. Because I think that focusing too much on the trees and ignoring the forest is just a recipe for problems later. Sometimes it's important, yes, you got to get your details right, but sometimes it's important to take the broader view and kind of see, not only what is your company's place in the market, but to find out, what other kind of companies may be out there who aren't competitors now, who might be in the future. What are the types of services that people are wanting to access using your networks? And dealing with things like technological evolution. the increasing prevalence of, someone asked the question about 4K video. I mean, the increasing prevalence of 4K content and the demand for that content is going to drive quite a bit of policy making at the commission, and quite a bit of some of this universal service funding and where it would be directed, but also your customers' expectations in terms of what they would want to get out of your service. I see 4K in particular as something that's increasingly becoming a reality, and it's never too late to plan for that sort of demand on the bandwidth that you're going to be providing. So I've made it through all the letters here, and I think we've got to give Jim some time.
Let's get some quick questions. Oh, turn me off. Yep.
Okay.
Some quick questions here for John while he's up here.
Yes, hello. Oh, I would say that's more of a risk management question than anything else. I mean, acceptable use policies, they kind of dovetail into your open internet disclosure in some ways, right? Because some of the ways that you manage traffic through a legal tool like an acceptable use policy would be subject to disclosure. If you're asking, is there some state law difference, for example, in like if you had a customer who accessed your website when a change was made at some point after they were handed a paper copy of a contract, I mean, that gets a little more complicated. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all sort of answer to that. But you could also be referring to what is a best practice, and the point I would make about that is it's important to recognize a piece of paper is finite, but terms and conditions get modified over time, and so that affects if folks access the website that you're operating over time, that they may impliedly in some circumstances be opting into a change in those terms and conditions that you made on your website, which is impossible to do on a fixed piece of paper.
All right here.
Yeah, that kind of, installs.
Well, that's true. So that's a couple of questions. So if you want to get legal advice on what your contract should say, lawyer. If you want to get some examples of what other people have done, members list, just ask for it and people will give them to you.
So most of you guys started off, y'all had lawyers do all that.
No, I copied mine from somebody else.
I did the lawyer. It really wasn't that expensive. I mean, once you start working with these guys, I mean, you're talking hundreds of dollars, not thousands of dollars, to come up with these contracts and statements.
Do you have a network of legal representatives across the country?
Do I? No.
So it's kind of a centralized model of legal services and support?
Well, it is, because most of the matters I would work on are grounded in federal law. I mean, if it were a matter that involved, a complicated interpretation of state law, that might be more appropriate for local counsel. But it sort of depends on, what the issue is. The fact that, many of these contracts that we're talking about dovetail into open internet means that, there's a federal issue kind of intertwined into it. There was a question in the back. Yes.
What exactly are forms that we're supposed to fill out that are local?
Am I right?
Supposed to know
Yeah,
what forms.
there's a question about what forms we have to fill out. The answer is longer than I would like, and it depends on the types of services you want to provide.
I think the session that's later this week is probably a good one.
Okay. So I should have written that down. I understand there's a session later this week that's specific to that. So, I mean, that might be. Otherwise, it might be a situation where someone asks me, what's Star Wars about, and because of time, I have to say it's about space.
Yeah, Wednesday, there's a 101 regulatory session. What form should I fill out? And it'll be like all sessions. So just for time, that's probably the best way to get your detailed questions answered. So I want to go ahead and thank John at this point in time and move on to the last presenter, who's going to talk about an important topic of mapping. That's you, Jim. You ain't out of it yet. Mapping is one of those things that you're all going to have to become really good at.
Hi, I'm Jim Patient, here with Link Technologies. How many of y'all here use a mapping program now to show your coverage area? Okay. And how many of y'all use that mapping program to do other things like 477 submission, end user pre-qualification, things like that. All right. Well, that's one of the things that, you know, there's several things that having a good coverage map of your network is going to help you with. Target marketing is one of them. Why do you want to send out marketing information to somebody that you can't get coverage to? Just wasted marketing dollars. So that's just one of the things. Another thing is the 477 submission. A lot of y'all have automated billing systems, and they'll take care of the subscriber data section of your 477. The fixed broadband deployment area is a little bit different. You need to, show the census blocks that you have coverage in or coverage in a portion of. So just geocoding client locations is not going to give you enough information to accurately submit that form. One of the other things is your salespeople. It's really difficult for salespeople to tell somebody on the phone, yes, ma'am, we can get you service, if you don't have a map or something to show where your service is covered, okay? So I started years ago, and like probably a lot of you do, put a guy in a truck, drive out there and see if you can get Miss Farmer a internet service. And you get out there and it's, well, too many trees and hills in the way. Sorry, we can't, but I gotta have service, but we can't get you service. And the lady's wrapped around your leg. I'll cut my trees, I'll cut my neighbor trees, I'll do whatever I gotta do. What it boils down to is you couldn't get them service. And there's really no sense to drive out to somebody's house that you know you can't get service to. So using your mapping program to identify areas, and you may have areas on the edge where you're still going to drive out and check. They may be close. You may be looking at a micro pop site, but having those maps and knowing your coverage areas is really important, especially when you're growing your WISP, because you want to be able to document where calls are coming in, whether you do it automated or you do it manually. You want to keep track of where those calls are coming from, and that allows you to identify unserved and underserved areas. Those are the areas typically you're going to want to target. But a lot of that stuff I'm talking about is pretty tough to do without having maps. So there's a lot of different mapping programs out there. Radio Mobile, Brian Webster's wireless mapping does it. I know some of the billing systems do a little of it. Wismon's changed over a little now, but and then obviously tower coverage. But there's several systems out there, and you just need to pick one and use it. If Radio Mobile is a great program, it's not exactly what I consider user friendly, not that easy to automate, but it is a good program for getting you good, accurate RF propagation coverage maps. So, Radio Mobile. And I only had just 15 minutes there, so I didn't.
Questions now?
Yeah, I think that pretty much covered the.
So, does anybody have any questions about mapping and why it's important and some other particular issues with mapping that you'd like to get some questions cleared up? So on the Form 477, that's a form you're all going to hear about if you go to the next session this week about what forms to fill out. The FCC wants to know in what census tracts you have customers and what speeds you sell to those customers, but they also want to have a separate file that shows what census tracts you provide service in. And that's it's a reason, because you may have coverage but you don't have customers for one reason or another, but they'd like to know that there's a service provider there, and that's what he's talking about there as far as a compliance issue. Yes. Wow.
How do you like to deal with trees when you're mapping?
Well, obviously you're not going to keep track of every tree and every density in the world, right? What we do is basically We use USGS topological survey data for the trees, but, and I don't know if I can speak for just tower coverage, on tower coverage you can identify, you can set tree heights and densities, and you can set multiple land clutter settings for tree heights and densities. So you might have a network up in the mountains where your trees are an average height of 80 feet and an average density. And then you might have a network down in the desert where you're going to have scrubs or mesquite trees that are going to be a lower density. So in there you set different default densities for the land clutter that's in your typical area for the terrain. And radio mobile is the same way. Most of them allow you to set specific default densities and heights for the vegetation in the area. Now, another thing you can do is verify the different vegetation actually exists in that area. And
So I wanted to answer that question from our perspective. So we do use a very sophisticated mapping program. We don't do the clutter because we just found it to be, hit or miss. So with my staff, the sales staff, they'll look to see what towers the customer can see based on a line of sight, but then they'll look at the map, the Google map that has the overhead flyover picture, and they've gotten to the point now where they can look and see and say to the customer, well, it looks like you got some trees pointed at such and such tower in this direction, and they look pretty tall, because you can kind of tell, how tall a tree is, and ask the customer to go look themselves to see if they can actually see through it. But it's that Google Maps that show you the real deal of what's going on there as far as the foliage is very useful, and your salespeople need to get involved in using that. Some mapping programs will include that process as well. Any more questions?
any other?
Oh, man. Oh, in the back.
You mentioned you use USGS topographic data as your data source. Main question around that is, how precise is that data? And if you had more accurate data, how useful would that be to predict this, again, ahead of time with analytics, line of sight, view shed, et cetera?
Well, there's more accurate data sets, and the accuracy of the USGS data varies in different places in the United States. Out on the East Coast, they have real good data. South of Chicago, it's not all that great. But depending on the area you're in, some of the USGS data is really accurate. And there again, I don't want to make this a sales pitch. That's why we put the slider on tower coverage link path, so you can actually slide the slider over, look what the USGS data is telling you there, and then verify it right on the map as you're looking at it. I don't know if other programs do that, but in some areas like in Europe, they have LiDAR data and some higher res data, but then you get to, you ask yourself the question now, how accurate do you really need tree data? I mean, do you want to have it so accurate that it's going to take 4 hours to render a map because it's taken so much granular tree data into account? You really want to, if you can get tree data down to show you've got a loss of 5 dB through it, that's pretty good. If you're down to where you're calling the shot on a truck roll on 5 dB, that's pretty good. I mean, if I see it, if I guess it or calculate it out within 5 dB, if I'm probably going to roll a truck roll. If my threshold cutoff, for that particular system is neg 60, and I see it comes in at a neg 65, I'm still going to probably roll a truck out there to verify it. I don't know of any system right now at all that is going to give you 100% down to 1 dB accuracy on penetrating through trees.
I think I just want to add a little bit to that, and that we use radio mobile, which is one of the suggestions that Jim talked about, and we use it for a proximity. So if a customer is in close proximity to coverage based off of radio mobile, we roll the truck. if they're not in close proximity to that coverage, we don't roll the truck. It's a tool to see, how effective taking that next step to an installation will be. It's not the ends to everything. There's other things that come into play, new construction and things like that may not be in the topographical maps. And it's always a challenge to make sure that you're as effective as possible. But in my mind, you're better off trying to get the customer that's on the fringe than just saying no.
Yeah,
Actually-
if they come in at a neg 90, you're probably not going to roll a
Yeah,
truck.
so like I said, like they're both saying, is that if it looks like it's probably a go on the map, you should go out there, because what's going to happen is you get out there and there'll be a percentage of these installs that all of a sudden there's something blocking it that you didn't see, but there's also a percentage of those, subset of those, that you're going to go out there and you're going to tell the customer, well, we didn't see this on our map, but your neighbor can see it clearly. Let's go talk to them. And now you got 2 sales. And you get a connection on the customer's neighbor, and you reflect it with a little repeater or redirector or whatever you want to call it, very inexpensive, and now you got 2 customers. So, these tools, the mapping tools from a perspective of qualifying a customer, you're never going to get 100%, but, it's better than being completely blind. I can tell you that right now. Any more questions? All right, I believe that is Miller time. Thank you.